Do you want to stay more focused on the right goals in your life, or even just figure out what the right goals are for you? Do you want clarity? Do you want better work-life balance? Well, you're in the right place. Welcome to Success Through Failure.
Welcome to the Success Through Failure podcast, the show that reveals failure as your path to success. You'll listen to intriguing interviews with some of the most successful people on the planet and learn how their failures became a launchpad for success and how yours can too. Here's your host, former Division I All-American wrestler, former Division I head coach, speaker, and personal coach, Jim Harshaw.
Welcome to another episode of Success Through Failure. Today, I bring you Don Yaeger. I've had tons of amazing guests on this show, well over 100 now, billionaires, astronauts, professional athletes, world-renowned entrepreneurs, and they've shared their insider secrets for success. They've offered everything from top book recommendations to success hacks to action items that you can use today to see results immediately. If you're like me, you love this kind of stuff. And if you're like me, you want to get the Cliff Notes, or I guess these days they call them the Spark Notes. Well, you can get access to the action plans from your favorite guests, like Spartan Race founder Joe DeSena from episode 27, or Navy SEAL Mark Devine from episode 45, or maybe fitness guru Tony Horton from episode 85, plus other amazing tips and tactics to help you get clear on how to get from where you're at to where you want to be. I put all this in one place because you're busy and you want to get what you need quickly so you can move on with your day. Here's what I want you to do. Go to jimharshawjr.com/action to get instant access to everything I just talked about. That's jimharshawjr.com/action. And if you're listening to this on iTunes, there are 3 dots on your screen. Just touch the 3 dots, select View Full Description. There you'll see the link to download all of the incredible resources and action plans that I just mentioned. Now for today's guest. Don is a nationally acclaimed inspirational speaker, longtime associate editor of Sports Illustrated, and author of over 30 books, 11 of which have become New York Times bestsellers. Don left Sports Illustrated in 2008 to pursue a public speaking career that has allowed him to share stories learned from the greatest winners of our generation, with audiences as diverse as Fortune 10 companies to cancer survivor groups. More than 250,000 people have heard Don's talks on what makes the great ones great. And for the listener, as usual, if you don't have time to listen to this entire episode, or if you hear something you like but you don't have a chance to write it down, make sure you grab your free copy of the action plan from this episode, as well as get access to action plans from all of my episodes. Just go to jimharshawjr.com/action. Don, welcome to the show.
Jim, thank you very much.
So let's just start with a little background on you, Don. Kind of, where you were born, where you grew up, kind of the 30,000-foot view of how you got from there to where you're at now.
Wow. Okay, I'll try to be quick with that. I was born in Hilo, Hawaii, on the Big Island of Hawaii, which right now is under siege, a volcanic siege.
Yeah,
so
no kidding.
Hopefully, I've still got friends and others there that I stay in touch with, and hopefully all turns out well. But my father was a preacher, a Methodist preacher, and ended up bouncing around several places. Ended up going to Japan for a little while before moving to Indiana for high school, where I went there, and then also to college at Ball State University. Majored in journalism, came out, started my career in Texas, working in San Antonio at the newspaper there, went to Dallas, then came to Florida before going to Sports Illustrated. And ultimately became the associate editor of Sports Illustrated, was there for almost 12 years. And during that period, started writing books. I was mentioning to you, my 28th book comes out this fall.
Yeah, wow, 28th.
And I've been fortunate enough that 11 of them have become New York Times bestsellers, which is a pretty, if you'd have told me in my lifetime I'd have one, I'd have been impressed.
Yeah, that's astounding.
So it's a it's a good sign that I've been blessed to work with some really great people, is what it really is.
Yeah.
So And now I do between one book a year. I do one book a year, and then I do between 60 and 80 speaking engagements a year at corporations throughout the world.
And after we hang up on our call here, is it okay to, or is it top secret right now who you're going to be talking to next and working with on your next book?
Oh no, it's totally good. My
Joe
next,
Namath.
Next book, it comes out in December, will be with Joe Namath, and we've been working together for nearly a year, and he's just an amazing man. Been an awful lot of fun and coming up next year is the 50th anniversary of his Super Bowl, which is crazy.
Wow, 50! Holy cow! Time flies.
Yes.
So, what's that book going to be like? Is that going to be sort of a biography by him or autobiography?
A big piece of it is it's autobiographical, but a big piece of the book is his efforts to heal himself, to work on the challenges of his both physical being and some of the things he's been through, and his work in the last 15 years to really heal himself. It's a pretty powerful story when you think of one of the toughest guys ever to play the game, and ultimately having to be brought to his knees like all of us have, and having to figure out how to get back up. So I have to tell you, it's as inspiring as anything I've ever worked on.
So Joe Namath is a guy who, is a hero to many and a legend and an icon. I don't know how much or how little, Don, you're willing to share about that, but I mean, can you tell us a little bit about his story and what kind of healing did he have to do?
Well, part of it was, he had a high profile incident where, in 2000, where he was on national television,
right,
just drunk because he was healing himself through alcohol. That's what he was doing, and he ends up leaning in on the reporter Susie Colbert and saying, "I want to kiss you" on national television, and it just doesn't get any more humiliating than that. Because of the way the world saw him at that moment. And the next day, Joe began the process of healing himself. He went to alcohol treatment, hasn't touched a drop since, and again, it's just a great reminder, given the lesson and the message of your podcast here, Jim, that at the end of the day, some of us have to be broken down completely in order to begin that rebuild, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we look at successful people and we don't realize that they're just people too, right? They're people who have struggles and who have addictions and challenges and things of their own that they're dealing with, and we look at them and think that their life is perfect and that they have everything, and we look at our own lives and we say, well, I don't have this or I don't have that, as opposed to looking at what we do have and realizing that success in anything is going to be a challenge, and that doesn't automatically mean that the rest of your life is going to be great. Everybody wants to be rich, right? Everybody wants to make more money, but it's like, and they think that's going to heal everything else. If I make more money, my marriage will be better, or if I make more money, then I'll join a gym, right? And it's like, it's like there's each of these individual areas of our lives that, even if you're a great football player and an icon, there may be challenges in other areas of your life. And it's one of the things that we reveal quite a bit on this show, Don, is those challenges and those struggles. And I imagine in your job working at Sports Illustrated, you were around some incredible names, incredible iconic names and legends that everybody listening would recognize. And I'm sure you heard, both sides of some of those stories, especially, you wrote some of those stories and have written a lot of those books. So who were some of the big names you came into contact with through your work at Sports Illustrated?
Gosh. Well, I mean, from the athletic side, probably just about anybody that your listeners would think of in that category of high performing and great. And then I had the opportunity to go deeper with some. John Wooden, the great coach at UCLA, and I worked together for 12 years, and we wrote a book together. Had an opportunity, and maybe one of my most cherished opportunities was to work with Walter Payton, the running back at the Chicago Bears. Walter was my hero growing up, and I was invited by Walter to live with him and his family for the last 10 weeks of his life while he was dying, and to write his autobiography. So I've just had just Michael Orr, the kid from The Blind Side, John Smoltz, you name them. I've just been lucky enough to get a chance to have them ask me to dig deep and tell the story.
So having spent so much time around incredible people, incredibly successful athletes, you talk a lot about what makes the great ones great. So what is it? What's that one secret? What makes the great ones great? And obviously it's not just one secret, but what are those things that differentiate them?
Well, so I will tell you the genesis of that title of that book and that speech that I give, which is about habits of high performance. Really, it dates back to I graduated from college. My father, as I mentioned, preacher, just a man of great wisdom. I'm getting ready literally to drive from our home in Indianapolis to my first job in Texas. And my dad, standing in the driveway, said, son, because of the profession you've chosen, you will end up in the presence of some really incredible people over the course of your lifetime. That's what journalists get the opportunity to do, right? And he said, you should make sure there's always one question you ask that will benefit you. You should always make sure, yes, you need to do what you need to do for your audience and your readers, but ask one question of each one of these people that will make you better. And ultimately, I decided to make it the same question for everybody. And that question was, if you could name one habit, what would that habit be? Give me one thing that allowed you to separate yourself from everyone else. And I asked that question over the course of 25 years of about 2,500 coaches and athletic champion types, business leaders. I asked it from a lot of folks and kept a whole series of notebooks just on their answers to that question. And when I sat down a few years ago, it was to try to look at all those notebooks and say what answers came up most frequently. And the number one answer that came up was that at some stage in their life, every one of these winners learned to hate losing more than they loved winning. That they expected to win, frankly. That's kind of where their mind was. They imagined winning at every turn. Failure, they had to make sure failure hurt. And the way they did that, frankly, was by very early learning to stop making excuses when you fail. That is the way we it's the way we as parents sometimes soothe things over for our children, right? It's the way we we try to make ourselves feel better about failures. We blame somebody, or we got some answer for it. And the truly great ones turn that switch off. They don't allow themselves to get to the excuse mode, because they know that the second you blame someone else, you never own your failure, right? And they'll only get better if they learn to own them.
I know that when I was competing, in my TEDx talk, I talk about my failures as an athlete that eventually led to my success. And you mentioned making sure your failure hurt. And I remember distinctly after my sophomore season, ending my season at the national championships in failure, I actually wrote down all of the pain that I felt in my heart, all of the pain. And I wanted to keep that. I wanted to retain that emotional struggle that I was in that moment, so that when there was a morning where I didn't feel like getting up early and going to work out, or if I just was having a bad week, a bad day, and just didn't feel motivated, I would look at that and I would remember that pain, because I never wanted to remember that pain again. You talk about hating losing. How do you cultivate that hate of losing? Because I think some people kind of brush it under the rug, or they say, that's okay, I'll do it next time. I mean, how do they cultivate that hate of losing? And does that, I think from the outside looking in, it might be able to say, well, that's kind of the negative side of something. Why don't we look at the love of winning? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, so I'll go in reverse order of your question there. I mean, everyone enjoys winning, right? So there's no one who doesn't enjoy winning. So that's the default position all of us are in. And so where they don't want to find themselves is, man, I just love to win. I just love what they discovered was, and again, this is general. I'm being general, but I'm also I can name off specific conversations with people, but what they said was that the truly great do by and large believe in themselves to a place where winning doesn't give them the joy it gives other people, right? It doesn't give them, they don't.
That's the normal. That's the standard.
They kind of expect it, right? And you could argue that that's unhealthy, but they argue that that's what exceptionalism is about, right? It's about being so good you should expect to win, but not expect to win without expect to win without having to put the effort in, right? I mean, that's not what they mean. It's not like teaching your kid you should show up expecting to win. No, you have to, but it's a byproduct of doing all the things that allow you to expect to win. And when that happens, then yes, it feels good because winning feels good for everybody. So the key to that, and this, and now we're reverting back to the first part of your question, and I shared kind of the beginning part of the answer, and which is the probably the lion's share of what they talk about, is that the way you learn to hate losing is by not pinning it on other people, right? And how often do we hear people say, "Well, the court was slippery, the referees were bad." The the other side in the negotiation had an advantage. We rather than saying, you know what, I'm blaming no one. I'm owning this failure, and I do not want to feel this again. What do I have to do? What do I have to do to not feel this again? Rather than allowing themselves to get into the blame game, they go. So when you talk about what you did, right, that you chronicled what it was that the pain felt like, that puts you in that upper 5%, because most people prefer to blame someone else when they don't get what they want, right?
Yeah.
It is sadly the default position for the majority. And unfortunately, that habit is taught early by parents, right? Who every time a child fails, they've given them a reason to not believe the failure is theirs. And that's just unhealthy. And it's especially unhealthy if you want to play life as a live life as a high performer.
So how do you cultivate that expectation to win? Because we go through life and there's failure, there's struggle. And you talked about, like parents, who I'm a parent of 4, and it's hard to see my kids struggle and to fail. But it's those struggles and those failures that are necessary to build resilience, to build the buzzword of today is grit. And through that, through the struggle, through the failure, how do you cultivate the expectation of winning despite, or maybe because of these failures, these struggles, the Walter Paytons of the world? How do they become great versus others who go through the same challenges and go through the same struggles? And their mindset becomes, maybe one of excuses, or maybe just one of like, well, I'm just not good enough, or it's just not meant to be for me, versus others, the great ones, who say, I expect to win. They just have that mindset, that deep, deep belief, even if they have the same proof out there in the world that everybody else has, the same world, they're grown up in this same world, the same, youth sports, the same schools, etc., the same society, they're hearing the same messages, but they go through the world with this expectation that I'm supposed to win. That's what I do.
Well, I mean, so first off, we are talking about exceptionalism, right? So we're not talking about that this is the mindset of everyone.
Sure.
Right? So we're talking about the high performers here.
Right.
and by and large, most high performers have experienced more victory than other people, right? That's how they got to become high performers. But the other thing, and I know you've referenced it in your discussions, a big piece of it is who's chirping in your ear,
sure.
Right? And what are they saying in your ear? What are they saying in your ear? And then how does that translate to what you're saying to yourself? I own a couple of companies here in Tallahassee, Florida. We have a business model around no excuses, right? So if anyone in our organization begins the excuse-making process when we're discussing something that didn't go our way, everyone is licensed to call them out for it, right?
That's great. I love it.
Here has the ability to say, whoa, that sure sounds like an excuse, And by making that our culture, right? What happens is we take every opportunity while other people are spinning their spinning cycles, trying to blame someone. We're using our cycle, our that same exact amount of time to evaluate what we could have done different or better. And so that's a real key right there, right? We all have time is a finite gift. What do you do with it? If every moment that you're blaming someone else you're wasting your gift. And the key here is, how do you manage that conversation internally, externally? How do you manage the conversation? And at a certain place, you begin to believe, I'm now doing all the things necessary. Wow, that's success. Yep, that came our way because we did the things necessary. And, doesn't surprise us. We're not shocked anymore by success. When some people are frankly just they're giddy, right? Because they had they didn't expect it to happen. So again, I hope the conversation's making sense, but a big piece of it is, and you talked about your coach, right? Playing a role.
Yeah.
A big piece of it is not just how we talk to ourselves, but who's talking to us and how is that conversation going?
Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about the environment of excellence as one of the main tenets of my teaching is who are you surrounding yourself? What are the messages that you're allowing into your life, whether they're coaches and coworkers and friends, et cetera, but also media. What is the media that you're allowing into your life or blocking out of your life? Because there's plenty of negativity out there, and by definition, we're surrounded by average. So how do we change that? How do we filter out the mediocrity and allow in only the strongest messages that are going to propel us forward? And sometimes those messages are hard to swallow, right? They're no excuses, and they're taking full responsibility and accountability, which can be hard.
And you hit on a really great point there, which is about who you surround yourself with. And the key to all of this, again, there's no magic bullet here. So, I love your opening question, but it was that idea of what's the one thing? There really is.
Everybody wants to know the secret.
But the key to all of it, because again, all of this is just makes sense, right? When Stephen Covey wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, what he really did was he studied 100 years of literature on high performance. And what he saw was that the messages were essentially all the same.
Yeah.
And they were for 100 years.
Yeah.
And in that 100 years, they didn't really vary from these 7 habits. They just were said differently, right? And so he tried to frame them properly. And in the years since he wrote 7 Habits, the messages haven't changed. They're all the same. One key, though, to all of it is intentionality, right? You have to be intentional. You have to, just as you said, with who you surround yourself with. That is intentional discussion. That's an intentional process for you. You don't let people wander into your inner circle. You're intentional about who's there. You don't let people determine what you don't just randomly watch whatever YouTube tells you comes next on your feed. you are intentional looking for what it is that you want, how you want to inspire yourself or how you want to feed yourself, right? That's what this is. And being intentional is a place where that's hard work, right? Because it's easier to let the world feed us. It's easier to let the world come to us.
Sure. To let things happen, right?
Be intentional.
Yeah. And longtime listeners will be familiar with this, but this idea of living intentionally and being intentional, I've defined this as the productive pause, and the definition is a short period of focused reflection around specific questions that will lead to clarity of action and peace of mind. It's this idea of getting off the treadmill of life, making conscious choices of, for example, who you surround yourself with, so that you end up with this clarity of action. Because so many people that I talk to, Don, are they don't know what's next. They're not sure what the next thing they should do or how do they get to the next level. But when you hit the pause button, ask yourself the hard questions. One of the questions might be around this philosophy of no excuses that you talk about in your companies is, what was my role in this failure? Or what can I do to overcome this challenge that seems to be outside of my control? What's my role in it? Or what could I possibly do? Hypothetically, if it were possible to overcome that, what could I do? And when you ask yourself these specific questions, it leads to clarity of action and peace of mind. It's not easy, but it leads to clarity of action and peace of mind, this living intentionally. It's not just clicking the next, like you said, the next YouTube video in your feed. It's actually being intentional about how you make choices and how you live.
Awesome. I agree.
And so, Don, we talked about sort of these things that make the great ones great. What about great teams? Is there any difference there?
Oh, absolutely. So again, and as someone involved actively in athletics as you are, you'll get this. 10 years ago, when I retired from SI, I began doing these corporate speaking engagements on individual high performance and what we were talking about here just now. And several years ago, one of the executives at Microsoft said to me, as much as we enjoy this, we'd really want to know, why are some teams capable of being relevant year in and year out? Why are the St. Louis Cardinals always there? What is it about the Boston or the New England Patriots or the Golden State?
You had to say the Patriots. I'm a Steelers fan. That hurts. Hurts a little bit, just a little bit.
The Steelers were that had that mojo for a long time.
Sure, no, I know.
But what is it about that allows some teams to be consistently relevant? And so I went on a journey, and actually I sat down and set up several criterion that I wanted to understand. Here's what a great team looked like to me, right? And it was by and large performance based, because that's ultimately how we define greatness some days. And I sat down to then reach out to those teams and say, would you allow me to come study you? And it was fascinating. They were all Nick Saban, Mike Krzyzewski, Tom Izzo. They all said yes. They said, come learn, but do us a favor. Whatever you learn collectively, we want to hear from you what it is you got, right? And it was a wonderful 5-year journey that took me all over the country just looking at the best teams. And the number one answer that came up over and over again was that the best teams have a collective sense of purpose. They're in service of something or someone, or there's something that they're out there to achieve and do that they know that they cannot do, that none of them could achieve individually. And it's not just that they know what that is, but the great teams feel it. They feel who they're in service of. They feel that sense of duty or connection to those who they are that their work product ultimately will benefit.
Don, my listeners like to get concrete action items out of these interviews. So if you have a coach listening, or a manager, or an entrepreneur, or a leader, and they say, okay, I understand the best teams have a collective sense of purpose. How do I create that? How do I cultivate that? You mentioned culture. You have this culture of no excuses at your companies. How do you cultivate this sense of collective sense of purpose if you're a manager or a leader of any type?
So it's actually, so here, I know you love to throw things in your show notes and other things. If anybody emails me to Don2, which is my personal email address, Don2, DON, the number 2, at team, like as in basketball team, 180.com, team180.com, I'll send them a series of questions that they can distribute among their team that will help them start to get their arms around whether or not what it is that the team sees as their collective sense of purpose. And that's a real value, right? Is that ability to start with. You have to know where you're starting before you can really start working on something. Ask your team, who are we in service of? Why does what we do matter? And if we fail to deliver on our commitment to those who we're in service of, what happens to them? There's a series of questions that you can ask yourself and your team, and then the feel it piece is, all right. So I'll give you an example. I serve on the national board of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, right? It's my favorite charity. I love it. And as easy as it is to say, of course, we know who we're in service of. We're in service of kids with life-threatening illnesses, right? And their families. They don't miss a moment, opportunity as an organization to bring in families who have recently experienced a wish to speak to us as a board and to take 5 to 10 minutes and tell us about the wish that was recently granted to them and how it changed their family dynamic. Now, as that conversation is wrapped up, there isn't anyone in the room who doesn't feel why what we do matters.
Yeah.
You may know it intuitively because you're a member of the board, right? You've read the website. I know why what we do matters, but sitting in the presence of someone who just went through it helps me feel why what it does matters.
Yeah, so you're connecting that logic to emotion, where you know something as a fact, and then you actually feel it in your heart.
Yep, you got the great medical device company out of Minneapolis, Medtronic. Medtronic makes implantable devices that keeps people alive, right? Now, everyone who works at the company knows that at the end of the day, what they're in the life-saving business. But once a year at one of their corporate events where all the employees are gathered, they bring in 6 families, and they let the families talk to their employees about why what they do matters and how it mattered to them. And every year, some young woman steps up and says, thank you to their employees. It's because your product did exactly what you said. My daddy walked me down the aisle this summer. Now, if you don't feel differently about working there after hearing that conversation, you're not living, right?
Yeah.
And so the point is, we all could talk about knowing your why. That's just the beginning. That sounds good. That's a really good conversation. But feeling your why is where it gets real.
Don, you've had an incredible career. You've started off as a journalist and Sports Illustrated, and now you're speaking across the country, writing amazing books, 11 New York Times bestselling books. What habits do you have, Don, that you feel have really set you apart and have helped you achieve the level of success that you've achieved?
Well, a big piece of it is I'm a learner by nature. I love to learn. I love to read and try to understand. Long before I went to work at Sports Illustrated, I used to argue that anybody that wanted to be a great writer should read Sports Illustrated because the writing there was so crisp and amazing and descriptive, and the word choices were to me amazing. And I used to read those sentences and try to ask myself, I wonder what kind of question the journalist asked to elicit that answer. And so I am wired to be a learner, and that to me, I think, is what is probably my greatest attribute, my greatest habit. I think I'm constantly learning from people, and there isn't any day in which I don't wake up excited because today I'm going to learn something new. that's gonna make me think differently tomorrow.
Don, can you tell us about a time where you failed? You've had incredible success, but along this journey of success, I found that there are failures that, when exposed, it helps those listening realize that their failures, their struggles, their obstacles, their setbacks are just a normal step on the path to success. Can you tell us about a time where you failed and maybe felt that self-doubt, that hopelessness that comes with failure, and how you were able to move through that?
Sure. I was in my last newspaper job was with the newspaper in Jacksonville, Florida. I was the political editor of the newspaper, so that's why I live in Tallahassee. And I wrote my first book, and it was doing pretty well, and I was getting the opportunity to do a fair amount of publicity around it, and in that entire effort, I got into a dispute with with my boss, the person who who I worked for, and I didn't manage that well, and ultimately, in my arrogance and my belief that I was really, really important and valuable, I overestimated what the company would put up with from me, and I think a lot of people do that, right? And I got fired. And I remember they made me drive over to Jacksonville to get fired, which is 2.5 hours from where I lived. And so I get fired, and I'm driving back, and I spent the first hour and a half crying, just driving back crying, just not sure, not sure what's going to happen next. How am I going to pay my bills? And I pulled over, and I even can remember what exit it was in. It was at. And I actually kind of pulled myself together and began thinking, that happened, right? I earned it, and that happened. And what do I do next? Rather than fretting, let's start planning. And by the time I arrived home back in Tallahassee, I had a plan for what I was going to do next. And it was, an hour and a half later.
Wow.
And I was making phone calls when I got home on and it led to my next book. It led to a career in a different direction. And a few weeks later, I actually got an offer to come back to the newspaper. They offered me my job back.
Wow.
But by then I'd already intellectually and I'd moved on. And, so I think a big piece of things, failure is real. And in this case, mine was self-inflicted, right? But Coach K at Duke is really famous for his whole discussion around next play, right? Doesn't matter what happened in the last play, it's the next play that matters. And often, we think about that when we think about failure, right? Next play, what do I do next? Sometimes the most important next play you make is the play you make after you've had a successful play, right? Is we're busy running down the court celebrating, and our opponent's sneaking up on us really quickly. So next play, what do you do? How do you shift, and where's that shift? Mine occurred in a McDonald's parking lot at an exit right off of Interstate 10. But where can people find their shift? And I think I took the appropriate amount of time for regret and fear and all the other, because that's what I needed. I needed an hour and a half to cry, and then I needed the rest of that time to move on.
And I want the listener to really understand this. This is a fascinating example of a productive pause. You did it right after a failure that left you out of a job and in tears, wondering what's next. And you grieved over it. And you, after this failure, so like you said, self-inflicted, and Don made a decision to say, okay, what's next, right? So for the listener, think about your this failure or failures in your past that's holding you back right now, stopping you from making a decision, or stopping you from trying something or taking a risk or doing that thing that you want to do so bad, but you failed. You dipped your toe in the water and you failed. Or maybe you went whole way in and you failed. You got fired. And what's your reaction? Have you taken the chance to ask yourself, what's next? Or what did I learn from this? And how can I get better from it? And that's just an amazing example, Don. I appreciate you sharing that with us. And that's a tough moment. And it's interesting to hear that, you get failed from a job as a journalist and you go into this incredible career as a journalist. So thanks for sharing that, Don.
Well, it's not always the moment I'm most proud of, but I think I feel pretty comfortable with what happened next.
Yeah, and it's interesting also to hear that so many times when somebody shares a story of failure, it turns into this gift that they didn't even realize. So there's this gift that came from this because you started making phone calls, you started taking action, and it led to, and then you get your job offer back and you're like, well, it's too late. I'm actually too far down this other, even better path that you wouldn't have discovered had you not been fired. So that's just a point of that story to keep in perspective for the listener. So this failure and your next failure, tomorrow, next week, next year, whenever it comes, when that door closes, another one opens. So keep walking down the path. Don, thank you so much for making time to come on the show. I'm going to have a link for the listeners to take a look at all your books. I'll have your Amazon book page there with all of your authors page link there, so anybody here can check out all of the books that Don has. Don, take a minute to promote yourself. Where can we find you, follow you, check out your books elsewhere, etc.?
Thanks. I appreciate that. And really, when I look at your audience, and I as much as I read to try to understand who would be listening here, my goal was to challenge them to really think about being great every day, right? That this is a daily. That yesterday's greatness doesn't really. It's not indicative of today's opportunity for success, right? We have to make this a daily ritual, and if there's anything I could do to help them, my website, donyaeger.com, which I know you'll reference in your notes. I love to stay in touch. I write a column every week for Forbes on these topics, and I'd love to be in their circle. So if they would, they'd add me, I'd be grateful.
Excellent. And for the listener, I will have links to his website, link to some of his articles, and make it easy for you to find Don, as well as his email address there, don2@team180.com. I'll have that in the action plan as well. Don, thank you so much for making time to come on the show.
My honor.
And for the listener, until next time, take the time to get clear on your goals and embrace failure as a stepping stone on your path to success.